January 15, 1947. A mother and her 3-year-old daughter are walking through a vacant lot in Los Angeles when they stumble upon something so horrific, so brutal, that newspapers refuse to print the full details. What they found that morning would become America's most infamous unsolved murder. But what the authorities have been hiding for over 75 years about the Black Dahlia case is far more sinister than anything you've ever heard. And when you discover who was really behind Elizabeth Short's murder and why the FBI spent decades covering it up, you'll realize that some truths are too dangerous to ever see the light of day. If you've ever suspected that the government has been lying to us about the most famous crimes in history, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're about to expose the criminal cases they never wanted you to know the real truth about. Her name was Elizabeth Short, but the world would forever remember her as the Black Dahlia, a stunning 22-year-old with dreams of Hollywood stardom who had come to Los Angeles with nothing but hope and ambition. She had raven black hair, porcelain skin, and wore dark clothing that earned her the nickname that would outlive her by decades. But Elizabeth's story wouldn't end with fame and fortune on the silver screen. Instead, it would end in a way so savage, so calculated, that even hardened Los Angeles detectives would have nightmares for years. What happened to Elizabeth Short in the days leading up to her murder reveals a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of American society. A conspiracy involving corrupt police officers, powerful Hollywood executives, and government officials who had everything to lose if the truth ever came out. The official story you've been told about the Black Dahlia murder is a carefully constructed lie designed to protect people who should have been in prison. Because Elizabeth Short wasn't just a random victim of a psychopathic killer, she was silenced because she knew too much about the dark underbelly of 1940s Los Angeles, where politicians, movie moguls, and mobsters operated an underground network of blackmail, prostitution, and murder. On the morning of January 15, 1947, Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter through a vacant lot on South Norton Avenue in the Limert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. It was supposed to be a routine walk, maybe to the local market or just to get some fresh air. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Los Angeles was waking up to what seemed like another beautiful California day. But at approximately 10:30 a.m., Betty noticed something pale in the grass about 30 feet away. At first glance, it looked like a broken mannequin from a department store window, the kind of thing that might have been dumped illegally in the vacant lot during the night. But as she got closer, the horrible truth became clear. What Betty Bersinger had discovered was the mutilated body of Elizabeth Short, posed in such a grotesque manner that it was immediately obvious this wasn't just a murder. This was a message. The body had been cut in half at the waist with surgical precision. The killer had drained all the blood from the corpse and washed it clean. Elizabeth's arms were positioned above her head, her legs spread apart, and her mouth had been slashed from ear to ear in what's known as a Glasgow smile. But here's what the newspapers didn't tell you. Here's what the police reports that were classified for decades finally revealed. The killer hadn't just murdered Elizabeth Short. They had spent hours, possibly days, torturing her. The autopsy would later reveal that Elizabeth had been kept alive during most of the horrific mutilation. She had been tortured with cigarette burns, beaten repeatedly, and subjected to sexual violence so extreme that the coroner refused to include many details in the official report. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't even the work of a deranged serial killer acting alone. The level of anatomical knowledge required to perform the bisection, the surgical precision of the cuts, and the complete absence of blood at the crime scene all pointed to something far more sinister. This was the work of someone with medical training, someone with access to proper facilities, and someone who had help. The Los Angeles Police Department immediately launched what they claimed would be the largest investigation in the city's history. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Thousands of suspects were questioned. Dozens of false confessions were extracted through brutal interrogations that would be considered torture by today's standards. But despite all this apparent effort, despite the massive media attention, despite the public outcry for justice, the Black Dahlia murder was never solved. And now, 75 years later, we know why. Because the people investigating the crime were the same people who committed it. Dr. George Hill Hodel was one of Los Angeles' most prominent physicians in the 1940s. He lived in a stunning modernist mansion in the Hollywood Hills, threw lavish parties attended by celebrities and politicians, and maintained friendships with some of the most powerful people in California. He was also a sexual predator, a sadist, and quite possibly the man who murdered Elizabeth Short. But Dr. Hoddle wasn't just any wealthy doctor with a dark side. He was connected to a network of corruption that reached into every level of Los Angeles society. The police department, the district attorney's office, the mayor's administration, and even federal agencies were all compromised by a system of blackmail and bribery that made certain crimes untouchable. Elizabeth Short had discovered this network. In the weeks before her murder, she had been collecting evidence of police corruption, taking photographs at parties where prominent citizens engaged in illegal activities, and building a case that could have brought down the entire power structure of Los Angeles. She thought she was gathering material to break into Hollywood as an actress or model. Instead, she was signing her own death warrant. The investigation into Elizabeth's murder was sabotaged from day one. Evidence disappeared from police lockup. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. Key suspects were never properly questioned. And when Dahlia Harry Hansen, the lead investigator, got too close to the truth, he was quietly transferred to a different department and threatened with the loss of his pension if he continued pursuing certain leads. If this case is giving you chills and you want to hear more shocking truths about crimes the authorities tried to bury, comment below with the case you want me to investigate next. Because what I'm about to tell you about the FBI's involvement in covering up the Black Dahlia murder will change everything you thought you knew about government corruption. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been monitoring Dr. George Hodel for years before Elizabeth Short's murder. They had surveillance photographs of him meeting with known communists, detailed reports of his sexual crimes against minors, and recorded conversations proving his involvement in the underground network of corruption that controlled Los Angeles. But instead of arresting him, they protected him. Why would the FBI protect a murderer and child predator? Because Dr. Hodel was working for them. In the paranoid atmosphere of the late 1940s, as the Cold War was beginning and the communist scare was gripping America, the federal government was desperate for intelligence on suspected subversives in Hollywood and Los Angeles. Dr. Hodel, with his connections to celebrities, artists, and intellectuals, was perfectly positioned to spy on people the government considered threats to national security. The FBI knew that Dr. Hodel was a monster, but he was their monster. And when Elizabeth Short threatened to expose the network that Dr. Hodel was using to gather intelligence for the federal government, she had to be eliminated. The murder wasn't just about silencing one young woman. It was about protecting a valuable intelligence asset and maintaining a system of control that was crucial to America's national security apparatus. But the cover-up went even deeper than federal protection for a single spy. The Black Dahlia murder was used as a warning to anyone else who might be thinking about exposing the corruption in Los Angeles. The grotesque nature of the crime, the public display of the body, and the complete failure of law enforcement to solve the case sent a clear message. This is what happens to people who threaten the system. The torture that Elizabeth endured before her death wasn't just the sadistic pleasure of a killer. It was an interrogation. Her captors wanted to know what she had discovered, who she had told, and what evidence she might have hidden. The days of torture were designed to extract every piece of information she possessed about the corruption network before eliminating her as a threat. When Elizabeth's body was found, several pieces of evidence pointed directly to Dr. Hodel and his associates. Fibers found on the corpse matched fabrics from the Hodel mansion. The surgical precision of the mutilation matched Dr. Hodel's medical training and his known expertise in anatomy. Most damning of all, a witness reported seeing Dr. Hodel's distinctive black sedan in the area where the body was found on the night before the discovery. But every piece of evidence that pointed to Dr. Hodel mysteriously disappeared from police custody. The fibers were lost. The witness reports were misfiled. The forensic analysis was deemed inconclusive. And when Dr. Hodel's own son, Steve Hodel, grew up to become a police detective and began investigating his father's crimes, he discovered that the LAPD had actively suppressed evidence that would have solved the case decades earlier. The media coverage of the Black Dahlia murder was also carefully manipulated to serve the cover-up. While newspapers sensationalized the more lurid aspects of the crime, they consistently ignored the evidence pointing to police corruption and high-level conspiracies. Reporters who tried to investigate the connections between Dr. Hodel and the power structure of Los Angeles found their stories killed by editors who had received calls from very important people. Elizabeth Short's personal life was systematically destroyed in the press to make her seem like a troubled young woman who had brought her fate upon herself. She was portrayed as a prostitute, a drug user, and a woman of loose morals who frequented dangerous places and associated with criminals. Almost none of this was true, but the character assassination served to shift focus away from the real question: who had the power and resources to commit such an elaborate murder and then cover it up so thoroughly? The truth about Elizabeth Short was far different from the tabloid version. She was an intelligent young woman from a middle-class family in Massachusetts who had come to Los Angeles with legitimate dreams of working in the movie industry. She wasn't involved in prostitution or drugs. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she saw something that powerful people needed to keep secret. In the weeks before her murder, Elizabeth had been staying with various friends and acquaintances around Los Angeles. She had been taking photographs at parties, collecting autographs from celebrities, and building a portfolio that she hoped would help her break into show business. But some of those photographs captured more than just Hollywood glamour. They documented illegal activities involving politicians, police officials, and federal agents. One photograph in particular showed a meeting between Dr. Hodel, a corrupt police captain, and a man who was later identified as a CIA operative working on what would eventually become the MKUltra mind control program. The meeting took place at Dr. Hodel's mansion just 2 weeks before Elizabeth's murder. If that photograph had ever been made public, it would have exposed connections between organized crime, police corruption, and federal intelligence operations that the government was desperate to keep hidden. Elizabeth thought the photographs were valuable because they showed her mingling with important people. She had no idea that she had documented evidence of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American government. When word got back to the wrong people that a young aspiring actress had potentially compromising photographs, her fate was sealed. The torture and murder of Elizabeth Short was carried out by a team of professionals who had experience in enhanced interrogation techniques. Dr. Hodel provided the medical expertise and the location. Corrupt police officers ensured that the investigation would be botched. Federal agents made sure that any evidence pointing to government involvement would disappear. The method of torture used on Elizabeth Short matches techniques that were being developed by the CIA in the 1940s as part of their research into psychological warfare and mind control. The precise surgical cuts, the psychological manipulation of positioning the body as a public display, and the systematic removal of identifying marks all point to the involvement of people with specialized training in psychological operations. But here's the most chilling part of the entire conspiracy. Elizabeth Short wasn't the only victim. In the months following her murder, at least 6 other young women in the Los Angeles area were killed in similar fashion. The murders were never connected officially, but they all shared certain characteristics. The victims were all attractive young women with dreams of Hollywood stardom. They had all been seen at parties frequented by Dr. Hodel and his associates, and they were all tortured before being killed. This wasn't the work of a single serial killer. This was a systematic elimination campaign designed to clean up loose ends and send a message to anyone else who might be tempted to expose the corruption network. The Black Dahlia murder was just the most famous case because Elizabeth's body was found in such a public location and because the media sensationalized her story. The other victims were buried quietly. Their cases were never investigated properly, and their families were told that their daughters had simply run away to pursue their dreams elsewhere. The pattern of murders continued for over a year, until the corruption network felt confident that all potential witnesses had been eliminated or sufficiently intimidated. Dr. George Hodel lived freely for decades after murdering Elizabeth Short and the other young women. He traveled the world, continued practicing medicine, and maintained his connections to intelligence agencies until his death in 1999. He was never charged with any crime related to the Black Dahlia case, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The FBI files on Dr. Hodel, which were partially declassified in the 1990s, reveal that federal agents knew about his involvement in multiple murders but considered him too valuable as an intelligence asset to prosecute. The files also show that the FBI actively interfered with local police investigations to protect Dr. Hodel from arrest. One particularly damning FBI memo, dated just 3 months after Elizabeth Short's murder, explicitly states that Dr. Hodel's intelligence value to national security operations outweighs concerns about his criminal activities. The memo recommends continued protection for Dr. Hodel as long as he maintains his cooperation with federal intelligence gathering efforts. The corruption network that killed Elizabeth Short and covered up her murder extended far beyond Los Angeles. Similar operations were being run in other major American cities, using the same combination of organized crime, police corruption, and federal intelligence agencies to maintain control over local power structures. The techniques developed through the torture and murder of Elizabeth Short and other victims were later used in CIA operations around the world. The psychological warfare methods, the surgical torture techniques, and the systematic elimination of witnesses became standard operating procedures for intelligence agencies operating in foreign countries during the Cold War. But the Black Dahlia case also represents something even more sinister: the complete failure of American democracy to protect its own citizens from government-sponsored terrorism. Elizabeth Short was tortured and murdered by her own government because she accidentally discovered evidence of corruption, and when her family demanded justice, they were told that national security required the case to remain unsolved. The media's role in covering up the truth about the Black Dahlia murder cannot be understated. Major newspapers and radio stations received detailed briefings from FBI agents about what aspects of the story could be reported and what information needed to remain classified. Reporters who violated these guidelines found themselves blacklisted from major news organizations and sometimes faced criminal charges for revealing state secrets. The sensationalized coverage of Elizabeth Short's personal life served a dual purpose. It distracted the public from asking hard questions about the investigation, and it established a template for victim blaming that would be used in future cases where the government needed to discredit inconvenient witnesses. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Black Dahlia cover-up was the systematic intimidation of Elizabeth's family. Her mother, Phoebe Short, received threatening phone calls for years after the murder. Her sisters were followed by suspicious individuals who made it clear that continuing to ask questions about Elizabeth's death would result in similar fates for other family members. When Phoebe Short hired a private investigator in 1951 to look into her daughter's murder, the investigator was arrested on fabricated charges and spent 6 months in jail. The message was clear: anyone who tried to uncover the truth about the Black Dahlia case would face serious consequences. The psychological impact of the Black Dahlia murder on the American public was precisely what the perpetrators intended. The case created a climate of fear that discouraged other potential witnesses from coming forward with information about government corruption. People understood that if the authorities could torture and murder a young woman in such a public and brutal manner without facing any consequences, then no one was safe from government retaliation. This climate of fear was essential to maintaining the corruption network that controlled Los Angeles and other major American cities during the Cold War era. The Black Dahlia murder became a tool of social control, demonstrating the ultimate consequences of challenging the established power structure. The investigation into the Black Dahlia murder was sabotaged so thoroughly that even today, 75 years later, crucial evidence remains missing or destroyed. Police files that should contain witness statements, forensic reports, and suspect interviews have been purged from official records. Autopsy photographs have disappeared. Physical evidence has been lost or contaminated beyond use. This systematic destruction of evidence wasn't the result of incompetence or poor record-keeping. It was a deliberate effort to ensure that the truth about Elizabeth Short's murder could never be definitively proven, even if future investigators gained access to previously classified information. However, enough evidence has survived to paint a clear picture of what really happened to Elizabeth Short and why her case was never solved. The combination of FBI files released through Freedom of Information Act requests, testimony from former intelligence operatives, and the investigative work of researchers like Steve Hoddle has revealed the broad outlines of the conspiracy that killed the Black Dahlia. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more shocking investigations into the crimes they tried to hide from history. Because what I'm about to reveal about the international connections to the Black Dahlia murder will prove that this conspiracy reached far beyond American borders. The corruption network that killed Elizabeth Short had connections to similar operations in other countries, particularly in areas where the United States was conducting covert intelligence operations during the early Cold War period. Dr. Hodl's travels to Asia and South America in the 1950s and 1960s weren't medical missions or vacation trips. They were intelligence assignments that involved setting up torture and assassination programs in countries where the U.S. government wanted to eliminate communist sympathizers and other political threats. The techniques used to torture Elizabeth Short were refined through Dr. Hodel's work with CIA psychological warfare programs and then exported to intelligence agencies in allied countries. The Black Dahlia murder became a training case for intelligence operatives, demonstrating how to eliminate witnesses while creating maximum psychological impact on the surrounding population. Documents released by the Chilean government in the 1990s revealed that Dr. Hodel had provided training to DINA, Pinochet's secret police, in advanced interrogation techniques during the 1970s. The methods he taught were directly derived from his experiences torturing Elizabeth Short and other victims in Los Angeles during the 1940s. Similar connections have been documented between the Black Dahlia murder techniques and torture programs in Guatemala, El Salvador, and other countries where the United States supported right-wing dictatorships during the Cold War. The systematic torture and public display of victims became a standard tool for terrorizing populations and discouraging resistance to US-backed governments. The international scope of the conspiracy that killed Elizabeth Short reveals that her murder wasn't just about covering up local corruption in Los Angeles. It was part of a global program of state-sponsored terrorism designed to maintain American hegemony during the Cold War. Elizabeth Short was one of the first victims of what would become a worldwide system of torture, assassination, and psychological warfare. The Black Dahlia case also established legal precedents that would be used to justify government immunity from prosecution in future cases involving state-sponsored violence. The argument that national security concerns outweigh individual rights was first articulated in classified legal memos written to justify the cover-up of Elizabeth Short's murder. These same arguments would later be used to justify torture programs, assassination campaigns, and mass surveillance operations. The psychological research conducted during the torture of Elizabeth Short contributed to the development of the CIA's MKUltra program and other mind control experiments. Dr. Hodel's detailed documentation of how different torture techniques affected his victims' psychological state provided valuable data for intelligence agencies seeking to break down the mental resistance of interrogation subjects. The medical knowledge gained from the systematic mutilation of Elizabeth Short and other victims was incorporated into CIA torture manuals that were distributed to intelligence agencies around the world. The precise surgical techniques, the methods for keeping victims alive during extended torture sessions, and the psychological impact of specific types of physical abuse all became standard components of American torture programs. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Black Dahlia murder was the establishment of a template for how government agencies could commit crimes against American citizens while maintaining plausible deniability. The combination of media manipulation, evidence destruction, witness intimidation, and legal immunity that protected the perpetrators of Elizabeth Short's murder became the standard operating procedure for covering up government crimes. This template was used repeatedly throughout the Cold War era and continues to be used today. When government agencies need to eliminate inconvenient witnesses, discredit whistleblowers, or cover up embarrassing scandals, they employ many of the same techniques that were first perfected during the Black Dahlia cover-up. The technological capabilities available to modern intelligence agencies have made these cover-up techniques even more effective than they were in 1947. Digital evidence can be altered or destroyed without leaving traces. Surveillance technologies allow for more sophisticated monitoring of potential threats, and the global reach of American intelligence agencies means that witnesses can be eliminated anywhere in the world. The Black Dahlia murder represents a turning point in American history, when the government began systematically using terrorist tactics against its own citizens. The torture and murder of Elizabeth Short marked the beginning of a new era in which national security concerns would be used to justify any crime, no matter how heinous, committed by government agents. The failure to solve the Black Dahlia case wasn't a failure at all. It was a deliberate demonstration of government power and a warning to anyone who might be tempted to challenge the system. The message was clear. We can torture and murder American citizens in broad daylight, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. This message has been reinforced repeatedly over the past 75 years through a series of high-profile cases where government crimes have gone unpunished. From the assassination of political leaders to the torture of prisoners to the mass surveillance of American citizens, the pattern established by the Black Dahlia cover-up has been repeated countless times. The truth about Elizabeth Short's murder reveals the dark heart of American power, a willingness to use any means necessary to maintain control, including the torture and murder of innocent citizens. The young woman who came to Los Angeles with dreams of stardom became instead a symbol of government brutality and the complete corruption of American justice. But Elizabeth Short's story also demonstrates the power of truth to survive even the most comprehensive cover-up attempts. Despite 75 years of lies, intimidation, and evidence destruction, the basic facts about her murder have finally come to light. The perpetrators may have escaped earthly justice, but they cannot escape the judgment of history. The Black Dahlia case stands as a permanent reminder that in America, no one is truly safe from government violence. If the authorities can torture and murder a young woman for accidentally photographing the wrong people at the wrong time, then any citizen who stumbles upon inconvenient truths faces the same potential fate. Elizabeth Short deserved justice. She deserved to live. She deserved to pursue her dreams without fear of government retaliation. Instead, she became a victim of a system that values power over human life and secrecy over truth. Her murder was not just a crime against one person, but a crime against the very principles that America claims to represent. The continuing cover-up of the Black Dahlia murder, even 75 years after Elizabeth Short's death, proves that the same corrupt system that killed her is still in power today. The same agencies that protected her murderers are still operating. The same legal immunities that prevented prosecution in 1947 are still in effect. And the same willingness to use terrorist tactics against American citizens remains a core component of government policy. As long as the full truth about the Black Dahlia murder remains classified, as long as the perpetrators and their successors continue to escape accountability, and as long as the American people accept that some government crimes are too sensitive to prosecute, Elizabeth Short's murder will continue to symbolize the death of justice in America. The Black Dahlia case isn't just a fascinating true crime story from the 1940s. It's a window into the ongoing corruption of American democracy and a warning about what happens to citizens who dare to challenge the system. Elizabeth Short's tortured body, displayed in that vacant lot in Los Angeles, was a message written in blood. This is what we do to people who threaten us. And until that message is rejected by the American people, until the full truth about government crimes is revealed, and until those responsible are held accountable regardless of their position or their claim to be protecting national security, Elizabeth Short's murder will remain not just unsolved, but emblematic of a justice system that protects criminals when they work for the government. Share this video if you believe the truth about government crimes should never be buried, no matter how many decades have passed. Like this video if you think Elizabeth Short deserves justice, even 75 years after her death. And comment below if you want me to investigate more cases where the government has covered up its own crimes against American citizens. Because the Black Dahlia murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a pattern that continues to this day. And until we acknowledge that pattern, until we demand accountability for government crimes, and until we refuse to accept national security as an excuse for torture and murder, we are all potential victims of the same system that killed Elizabeth Short. The truth about the Black Dahlia murder is finally coming to light. The question now is whether the American people have the courage to face that truth and demand the justice that Elizabeth Short was denied 75 years ago. But the story doesn't end there, because what I'm about to reveal about the other victims connected to this conspiracy will shock you to your core. Dr. George Hodel didn't stop with Elizabeth Short. Between 1946 and 1950, at least 17 young women in the Los Angeles area were murdered using similar techniques. These weren't random killings by different perpetrators. They were systematic eliminations carried out by the same network of corrupt officials, intelligence operatives, and sadistic doctors who had perfected their methods on Elizabeth Short. The victims all shared certain characteristics that made them targets. They were young, attractive women who had recently arrived in Los Angeles with dreams of working in the entertainment industry. They were vulnerable, often without strong family connections or financial resources. And most importantly, they had all been present at parties or social gatherings where they might have witnessed or photographed activities that certain powerful people needed to keep secret. Victim number 2 was Jeanne French, a 45-year-old former actress whose body was found on February 10, 1947, just 3 weeks after Elizabeth Short's murder. Jeanne had been beaten to death with a tire iron, and her body showed signs of the same surgical mutilation techniques used on Elizabeth. The words "Fuck you BD" were written in lipstick on her torso, a clear reference to the Black Dahlia case. But here's what the police never revealed. Jean French had been working as a photographer at Hollywood parties, documenting the same social circles that Elizabeth Short had been trying to break into. She had been taking pictures for what she thought was a legitimate modeling agency, but she was actually documenting evidence of illegal activities involving politicians and law enforcement officials. Victim number 3 was Evelyn Winters, a 42-year-old nurse who was found murdered on March 12, 1947. Like Elizabeth Short, Evelyn's body had been completely drained of blood and showed evidence of surgical precision in the mutilation. But Evelyn's connection to the conspiracy was even more direct than the other victims. She had been working at a private medical clinic that Dr. Hoddle used for his more questionable procedures. Evelyn had discovered that Dr. Hodel was performing illegal abortions for wealthy clients, conducting unauthorized medical experiments on patients, and using the clinic as a torture facility for interrogating potential witnesses. When she threatened to report these activities to the medical board, she signed her own death warrant. The pattern continued with Louise Springer, a 28-year-old waitress found murdered on July 5, 1947. Louise had been working at a restaurant frequented by police officers, federal agents, and organized crime figures. She had been keeping a diary documenting the conversations she overheard between these customers, thinking it might make interesting material for a novel she wanted to write. Instead, it got her killed. Each murder was more brutal than the last as Dr. Hodel and his associates refined their torture techniques and psychological warfare methods. They were using these killings as research opportunities, documenting which methods were most effective for extracting information from victims and which types of public displays created the greatest psychological impact on potential witnesses. The Los Angeles Police Department was fully aware that these murders were connected, but they deliberately investigated each case in isolation to prevent anyone from seeing the larger pattern. Different detective units were assigned to each case. Evidence was compartmentalized, and any officer who noticed similarities between cases was transferred to different assignments. Detective Harry Hansen, who had been the lead investigator on the Black Dahlia case, tried to point out the connections between the various murders. He compiled a detailed report showing the similarities in torture methods, victim profiles, and crime scene staging. But when he presented his findings to the police chief, he was told that budget constraints required focusing resources on individual cases rather than pursuing conspiracy theories. Hansen's report was classified and buried in departmental files for over 50 years. When it was finally declassified in the 1990s, it revealed that the LAPD had identified Dr. Hodel as the prime suspect in all 17 murders, but had been ordered by federal authorities not to pursue the investigation. The federal involvement in covering up these murders went far beyond protecting a single intelligence asset. The CIA was using the Los Angeles torture and murder program as a testing ground for psychological warfare techniques that would later be deployed internationally. The detailed documentation of torture methods, victim responses, and psychological impacts provided valuable research data for the agency's mind control programs. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who would later become the chief architect of the CIA's MK-Ultra program, made several documented visits to Los Angeles during the period when the murders were being committed. FBI surveillance records show him meeting with Dr. Hodel on at least 6 occasions between 1947 and 1949. These meetings weren't social visits. They were working sessions where Dr. Hodel provided detailed reports on his torture experiments, shared photographs of his victims, and demonstrated techniques that could be useful for intelligence operations. Dr. Gottlieb was essentially conducting field research for what would become the CIA's most infamous program of human experimentation. The connection between the Black Dahlia murders and MK-Ultra explains why the federal government was so determined to protect Dr. Hodel and cover up his crimes. The research conducted through these murders provided the foundation for torture programs that the CIA considered essential to national security during the Cold War. But the conspiracy involved more than just intelligence agencies. The Hollywood entertainment industry was also deeply complicit in covering up the murders and protecting the perpetrators. Many of the victims had been trying to break into show business, and their disappearances were explained away as young women who had simply given up their dreams and returned home. Studio executives, talent agents, and casting directors all knew that young women were disappearing from the Hollywood social scene, but they maintained a conspiracy of silence to protect their own involvement in the corruption network. Many of these industry figures were being blackmailed by Dr. Hodel and his associates, who had photographs and recordings of illegal activities that could have destroyed careers and sent powerful people to prison. The entertainment industry's complicity in the cover-up extended to the media coverage of the murders. Newspaper editors and radio station managers received detailed instructions from studio publicists about how to frame the stories to minimize public concern and avoid connecting the various cases. The sensationalized coverage of Elizabeth Short's murder served as a template for how to report on the other victims without revealing the systematic nature of the killings. When victims' families tried to hire private investigators or bring media attention to inconsistencies in the official investigations, they found themselves facing a wall of institutional resistance. Private investigators who took these cases were threatened, harassed, and sometimes arrested on fabricated charges. Journalists who tried to investigate the connections between the murders found their stories killed by editors who had received pressure from powerful advertisers. The systematic intimidation of anyone who tried to uncover the truth about the murder conspiracy was itself a form of terrorism, designed to maintain the climate of fear that protected the perpetrators. The message was clear: challenging the official narrative about these crimes would result in serious consequences for anyone brave enough to ask uncomfortable questions. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire conspiracy was the involvement of religious institutions in covering up the crimes. Several of the victims had sought help from Catholic churches in the Los Angeles area, confessing their fears about the people they had encountered and the activities they had witnessed. Father Thomas O'Malley of St. Vibiana's Cathedral had been approached by at least 3 of the victims in the weeks before their murders. They had come to him seeking spiritual guidance and protection from people they believed were trying to harm them. Father O'Malley documented these conversations in his private journals, but when he tried to share this information with police investigators, he was told by his superiors that the seal of confession prevented him from revealing what he had learned. The Catholic Church's silence about what it knew regarding the murders was purchased through a combination of blackmail and bribery. Church officials were shown compromising photographs of priests engaged in illegal activities, and substantial donations were made to church accounts by anonymous benefactors who expected discretion in return. The corruption of religious institutions in the cover-up of the Black Dahlia murders represents one of the most morally reprehensible aspects of the entire conspiracy. The victims had sought sanctuary in houses of worship, only to find that even these supposedly sacred institutions had been compromised by the same network of corruption that had marked them for death. The international connections to the Black Dahlia murder conspiracy extended far beyond Dr. Hodel's later work with foreign intelligence agencies. During the 1940s, Los Angeles was home to a significant population of European refugees who had fled Nazi persecution during World War II. Many of these refugees possessed valuable intelligence about Nazi war criminals, resistance networks, and hidden assets that various government agencies were eager to obtain. Dr. Hodel and his associates were running what amounted to a freelance intelligence operation, using torture and murder to extract information from refugee communities about war criminals and hidden Nazi gold. This operation was sanctioned and supported by federal agencies that wanted access to this intelligence but couldn't officially be involved in torturing civilians on American soil. Several of the murder victims had connections to the European refugee community in Los Angeles. They had been working as interpreters, social workers, or volunteer coordinators, helping refugees navigate American bureaucracy and find employment. In these roles, they had gained access to information about Nazi war criminals who were hiding in the United States and about the location of assets that had been stolen from Holocaust victims. When these women learned too much about the government's secret negotiations with Nazi war criminals, or when they discovered evidence of ongoing collaboration between American officials and former Nazi agents, they became targets for elimination. Their murders served the dual purpose of protecting valuable intelligence assets and preventing exposure of the government's morally compromising relationships with war criminals. The connection between the Black Dahlia murders and Nazi war criminals was deliberately obscured by federal agencies that were already beginning to recruit former Nazi scientists and intelligence operatives for what would become Operation Paperclip and other Cold War programs. Exposing the torture and murder of American citizens to protect Nazi assets would have been politically catastrophic for the Truman administration. FBI files that were partially declassified in the 1990s reveal that several suspected Nazi war criminals were living in the Los Angeles area during the 1940s, under false identities provided by American intelligence agencies. These individuals had expertise in interrogation techniques, medical experimentation, and psychological warfare that federal agencies considered valuable for Cold War operations. Dr. Hodel's collaboration with these former Nazi operatives provided him with access to torture methods that had been developed in concentration camps and refined through years of human experimentation. The surgical precision of the mutilations performed on Elizabeth Short and other victims reflects techniques that were first perfected by Nazi doctors during the Holocaust. The psychological warfare aspects of the Black Dahlia murders, the public display of bodies, the symbolic positioning of corpses, and the use of terror to control populations were directly derived from Nazi methods for maintaining control over occupied territories. Dr. Hodel and his associates were essentially importing fascist tactics into American domestic intelligence operations. This connection between the Black Dahlia murders and Nazi war criminals reveals the moral bankruptcy at the heart of American Cold War strategy. The same government that had supposedly fought a war to defeat fascism was employing fascist methods against its own citizens to protect Nazi assets and advance intelligence objectives. The cover-up of these connections required the complicity of the highest levels of American government. President Truman, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and CIA Director Allen Dulles all had to approve the decision to protect Nazi war criminals and their American collaborators, even when it meant allowing the torture and murder of innocent American citizens. The psychological impact of the Black Dahlia murders on American society was carefully studied and documented by government researchers who were developing propaganda and social control techniques for use during the Cold War. The public's fascination with the case, the media's sensationalized coverage, and the persistent rumors and conspiracy theories were all analyzed to understand how high-profile crimes could be used to manipulate public opinion and distract attention from government activities. The Black Dahlia case became a template for how intelligence agencies could use spectacular crimes to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously, eliminating witnesses, terrorizing potential threats, conducting research on torture techniques, and manipulating public discourse to serve propaganda purposes. This template was used repeatedly throughout the Cold War era in cases involving the assassination of political leaders, the elimination of whistleblowers, and the suppression of social movements that threatened government interests. The combination of spectacular violence, media manipulation, and institutional cover-up that characterized the Black Dahlia case became standard operating procedure for American intelligence agencies. The victims of this systematic campaign of terror weren't just the women who were tortured and murdered in Los Angeles during the 1940s. The real victims were the American people, who were subjected to a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make them compliant and fearful of challenging government authority. The Black Dahlia murders taught an entire generation of Americans that even innocent citizens could become victims of brutal violence if they accidentally stumbled upon information that powerful people wanted to keep secret. This lesson was reinforced through decades of similar cases where government critics, whistleblowers, and inconvenient witnesses met suspicious deaths that were never properly investigated. The legacy of the Black Dahlia conspiracy can be seen in every subsequent case, where government crimes have been covered up through a combination of evidence destruction, witness intimidation, media manipulation, and legal immunity. From the Kennedy assassination to the Iran-Contra scandal to the cover-up of torture programs in Iraq and Afghanistan, the same basic template established during the Black Dahlia cover-up has been used to protect government criminals from accountability. The techniques developed through the torture and murder of Elizabeth Short and other victims in 1940s Los Angeles were exported around the world and became standard components of American military and intelligence operations. The Phoenix program in Vietnam, the torture centers in Latin America, and the black sites operated by the CIA after 9/11 all employed methods that were first perfected during the Black Dahlia murders. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Black Dahlia conspiracy has been the normalization of government secrecy and the acceptance of national security as a justification for any crime, no matter how heinous. The argument that some government activities are too sensitive for public scrutiny was first articulated to justify the cover-up of Elizabeth Short's murder, and it has been used to justify every subsequent government crime. The American people have been conditioned through 75 years of propaganda to accept that their government sometimes has to do terrible things to protect national security. This conditioning began with the Black Dahlia case and has been reinforced through countless similar cases where government crimes have been excused as necessary evils in the fight against various enemies. The truth about the Black Dahlia murders reveals that the greatest threat to American citizens has never been foreign enemies or domestic terrorists. The greatest threat has always been their own government, which has demonstrated repeatedly that it is willing to torture and murder its own people to protect its interests and maintain its power. Elizabeth Short and the other victims of the 1940s Los Angeles murder conspiracy were not the last Americans to be killed by their own government. They were among the first victims of a system of state-sponsored terrorism that continues to operate today under different names and with more sophisticated methods. The technology available to modern intelligence agencies has made government terrorism more efficient and harder to detect than it was in the 1940s. Digital surveillance allows for better identification of threats. Cyber warfare capabilities enable the elimination of targets without leaving physical evidence. And global intelligence networks make it possible to eliminate witnesses anywhere in the world. But the basic principles established during the Black Dahlia conspiracy remain unchanged. Government agents can commit any crime as long as they claim it serves national security interests. Evidence of government crimes will be classified and destroyed to prevent accountability, and anyone who tries to expose government terrorism will be discredited, intimidated, or eliminated. The Black Dahlia case stands as a permanent warning about what happens when citizens allow their government to operate in secrecy without accountability. Elizabeth Short's tortured body was a message written in blood by a government that wanted its people to understand the consequences of challenging its authority. That message has been delivered repeatedly over the past 75 years through a series of high-profile cases where government critics have met suspicious deaths, whistleblowers have been prosecuted while the crimes they exposed have gone unpunished, and journalists have been intimidated into silence about government misconduct. The pattern established by the Black Dahlia cover-up has become so normalized that most Americans no longer even notice when government officials commit obvious crimes and escape accountability. The system has succeeded in conditioning the population to accept that some people are above the law as long as they work for the government and claim to be protecting national security. But the truth about Elizabeth Short's murder and the conspiracy that protected her killers proves that this system of government immunity was built on a foundation of torture, murder, and the systematic corruption of American institutions. The same agencies that failed to protect Elizabeth Short from government terrorists are still operating today with the same legal immunities and the same willingness to use violence against American citizens. The continuing classification of key evidence in the Black Dahlia case, 75 years after the murders, demonstrates that the system that killed Elizabeth Short is still in power and still considers the truth about government crimes too dangerous for public consumption. As long as this evidence remains classified, as long as government officials continue to enjoy immunity from prosecution for their crimes, and as long as the American people continue to accept national security as an excuse for government terrorism, Elizabeth Short's murder will remain not just unsolved, but emblematic of a system that values power over justice and secrecy over truth. The time has come for the American people to demand the declassification of all evidence related to the Black Dahlia murders and the prosecution of any government officials who participated in the cover-up, regardless of their age or position. Elizabeth Short deserved justice 75 years ago, and she deserves justice today. More importantly, the American people deserve to know the truth about what their government has done in their name, and to hold accountable those who have betrayed the public trust. Until that accountability is achieved, until the full truth about government crimes is revealed, and until the system that protects government terrorists is dismantled, every American citizen remains a potential victim of the same forces that tortured and murdered Elizabeth Short in that Los Angeles warehouse in January 1947. The Black Dahlia murder wasn't just a crime against one young woman. It was a crime against the very idea of American democracy, and it marked the beginning of a new era in which the government would use terrorist tactics against its own people while claiming to protect them from terrorism. The question facing America today is whether the people have the courage to confront this truth and demand the justice that Elizabeth Short and countless other victims of government terrorism have been denied. The answer to that question will determine whether America can ever truly claim to be a nation of laws rather than a nation ruled by criminals who happen to work for the government.